You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
It's the 17th of June, 1970. Jeannette and Harvey Crewe sit down to eat dinner in their quaint home on their farm in Pakikawa, New Zealand. The married farmers have prepared a hot meal after a cold day working the land. Fish fillets and veggies. Flounder. It would be their last supper. 5 days would pass before Jeanette's father Len popped in to visit his daughter, only to discover a disturbing scene. Blood-stained carpet and rearranged furniture was evidence of a struggle. Their half-eaten dinner had dried up and rotten. Harvey's favourite armchair had turned a different colour, completely caked in a new, dark, dried burgundy. There were no bodies, but whoever's blood was spilled throughout the home was either seriously injured or dead. The only life left in the home came from a cry down the hallway. Jeanette and Harvey's 18-month-old baby, Rochelle. Alive and seemingly unharmed in her cot, Len's granddaughter had made it through almost a week without her parents. When was her last meal? The last nappy change? How long had it been since her last sip of milk or water? Early investigations into the disappearance of Jeannette and Harvey Crewe were shrouded in mystery. Questions over what happened to Rochelle's parents on that June night. Who would want to hurt them and spare her? Questions that would intensify over the coming months. The discovery of the couple's bodies months later in the Waikato River would land a man in prison for a crime he didn't commit. And after more than 50 years, 2 guilty convictions, a pardon, revelations of police corruption, and a royal commission later, no one has been held to account for the murders of Jeannette and Harvey Crewe. I'm Emma Gillespie and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. The murders of Harvey and Jeannette Crewe in June 1970 were labelled the death of innocence in New Zealand and would go on to become one of the country's most infamous cold cases. After their brutal murders, a man named Arthur Allan Thomas was found guilty. His fate was sealed by a piece of evidence so compelling that a jury had no doubt he was the killer. But over the coming years and decades, that piece of evidence, a gun shell cartridge dug up near the murder scene, would be revealed to be planted. Arthur Allan Thomas was framed, and those who conspired to put him behind bars were the very officers who were meant to be protecting a community and finding those responsible for the deaths of Harvey and Jeannette Crewe. Thomas was granted a royal pardon in 1979 and awarded nearly $1 million compensation after serving 9 years in prison. A Royal Commission of Inquiry concluded the shell in that garden had been planted by police. It described the fabricated evidence as an unspeakable outrage. Thomas's lawyer, Peter Williams QC, described the case as a turning point in New Zealand history, which left the reputation of the police tarnished forever. Journalists Kirsty and James Hollings have been investigating this case for years and are in the process of compiling their research in a book which is set to be released later this year. Kirsty is an award-winning investigative journalist who's worked for many of New Zealand's most reputable publications, while James is Associate Professor of Journalism at Massey University in Wellington, where he teaches investigative journalism. Kirsty and James join us now. Let's start with New Zealand in 1970. What was the country like at that time, and What kind of a life were Harvey and Jeannette living?
Well, New Zealand at the time was very, I would say, pedestrian. They lived in a little town called Pukekawa, which is about an hour south of Auckland, on farmland. And, things there kind of revolved around farming, the weather, rugby. Like the biggest event in the social calendar was like the rugby club jubilee. It was pretty conservative. So before they got married, Jeannette and Harvey had both been working. Jeannette was a school teacher. Harvey was a shepherd, which is, kind of working on a farm with sheep. They're both from farming families, but they'd gone to very nice boarding schools. And Jeannette in particular had travelled a lot. She was quite sophisticated. Her family were very wealthy. And then so when they got married 4 years before the murders happened, they moved back to Pukekawa where her family had land. And I think it was a bit of a shock for both of them, wouldn't you say, James?
I think it was, yeah. Jeannette had seen the world, she'd had a glimpse of the world, and she was a hard-working, very professional teacher, and she had a chance to sort of break free of this quite closed community in Pukekawa, and then she came back to it. She married a farmer. So I think both of them, you get the impression that they didn't really gel with the local community that well, and there were sort of hints that they were sort of thinking about pulling up sticks and moving to a bigger, better farm somewhere else. And so the locals felt that they were a little bit standoffish, friendly, nice people, but not wholehearted joiners of the rugby club jubilee and those sort of events.
What was their marriage like and their relationship, particularly when they moved to Pukekawa, they've become part of their family, living life on the land? Did that put a strain on their lives, their relationships?
So they met in another town called Whanganui, and they were engaged at Easter and married by June. So things kind of happened quite quickly. They'd been courting for a while, but basically the week they got married, they moved back to Pukekawa. And they were very in love. Like everybody said, they had this instant connection. But I think it probably did put a strain on it being back in Pukekawa. And then there were a series of incidents that happened that kind of overshadowed what should have been this kind of quiet life for them striving on the farm. So they'd been back in Pukekawa about 18 months and they were burgled. They came home one night to find that somebody had been through their bedroom and had taken a lot of Jeanette's kind of expensive jewellery. So they reported that to the police and nothing was found. The fingerprints, but nothing really happened. So that really kind of unnerved them. And then there were two subsequent events, two fires. One was in their house in what was to be their baby's bedroom. It was kind of very soon before they had the baby. And then another was in their hay shed quite soon afterwards. So by that time, kind of friends and neighbours said they were getting quite stressed. Particularly Jeannette was really nervous to be at home by herself. She would kind of follow Harvey around the farm.
Was that behaviour typical of the area that they were living in? Was there a high crime rate, or was this targeted attacks on Harvey and Jeannette?
No, it certainly wasn't typical. There were fires from time to time in the neighbourhood because there were hay barns, and hay barns occasionally catch fire spontaneously. But there were occasionally burglaries, but very rare. It's not a common thing in this area at this time. It's not common in New Zealand at all at this time. And so they had good reason to feel targeted and good reason to feel worried. I think Harvey said to someone, "Who would do this to me?" when he saw his hay barn go up in flames, literally a year before they were murdered.
Kirsty, you said that the police were dismissive of perhaps the Crews after their murder. Were they dismissive as well before that, when there were these earlier incidences of robberies, fires?
So the burglary was reported to the police and the kind of rural cop was assigned to investigate it. His name was Len Johnston, and he would actually eventually also work on the Crewe murders. So, it was the 70s. They didn't have all the technology they had now. They did fingerprint the room and everything, but there weren't any matches taken. Most of the fingerprints they found were just Jeanette's fingerprints, but it doesn't really appear that they put too much effort into investigating it. The burglary file was really thin, it wasn't particularly well investigated. Yeah, and then both of the fires weren't reported to the police, even though the first one, he really thought at the time that the fire had been set. He thought somebody had lit it in there, but the fire investigator didn't agree with him. And so they kind of had an argument, but notwithstanding, it wasn't reported to the police because I think to do that, the fire investigator would have had to classify it as an arson.
Let's move to June 1970. What can you tell me about the discovery that Jeanette's father made?
So Len Demler, who is Jeanette's father, lived next door on the farm next door. And he'd had dinner with them on Tuesday night, Tuesday, June the 16th. And they talk about his birthday, what he wanted for his birthday, which was coming up. He didn't see them for 5 days. In fact, the last time they were seen was on the next day, the Wednesday afternoon, when they'd been at a stock sale nearby, at a town nearby. Then there was supposed to be some stock picked up from Harvey and Jeanette's farm on the Monday morning. And the stock agents had started ringing on the weekend just to remind Harvey that the stock truck was coming on Monday morning and have them ready. And they didn't get any reply. They rang again on Monday morning, no reply. So they then rang Len Demler, who lived next door, and said, "You better get down there and have a look. Harvey seems to have forgotten something going on." Harvey went down the Monday morning, went into the house and saw bloodstains along the living room floor, bloodstains on the couch. He then went into Rochelle's bedroom and found Rochelle, the baby, 18 months old, in her cot. Obviously hungry, obviously dehydrated, but alive. Then Len, by his own account, decided he needed to, first of all, go back to his farm and cancel the stock truck. So he got back into his car, drove back up to his farm 5 minutes away, and cancelled the stock truck, leaving Rochelle alive in the cot in the house. Then he got back in his car and drove to the neighbour's house, a man called Owen Priest, and picked up Owen and took him back to the house to see what was going on. Owen went ahead, thinking Len was right behind him, walked into the house, discovered what Len had just discovered, bloodstains on the floor, no sign of the Crews, Rochelle in her cot. He looked back and Len was still at the back door. At that point, Owen thought, what the hell's going on? And apparently Len then said to Owen, "I think the bugger's done her in," meaning Harvey. They then called the police and Len took Rochelle down to a neighbour's house, a woman down the road called Beverly Willis, to look after. The local police constable was the first to arrive. He tried to seal the house, but not particularly effectively. And then a couple of hours later, the big wheels arrived from Auckland, the police detective, a guy called Bruce Hutton, who was to oversee the whole inquiry.
How significant was the blood that was found throughout the house? Did that give police an indication that whoever's blood it was either seriously injured or dead? What sort of leads did they have to go off from there?
So from the beginning, they knew there was a lot of blood. Their initial impression was kind of the same as Len Demler. They thought possibly Harvey had killed his wife and was hiding. So when they were first searching, the first day or two, they kind of thought they might be looking for one body. And then I think over time, as Harvey obviously never showed up, they formed the view that there were two people who had died. Particularly, there was an armchair in the living room and there was a lot of blood that had kind of dripped right through the armchair onto the floor below. So that gave them an idea that somebody had probably died in that chair. Secondly, there was a different type of blood that had been found kind of around the edges of some carpet. And after talking to Len, they realised that there had been a mat in front of the fire. And so the killer had put that mat and a cushion in the fire and burned it, obviously to try and cover up some kind of evidence. So that kind of led them to believe that there were two people, two types of blood, and a lot of blood.
There was a couple of other things added to this sort of slightly gothic sense of mystery about the whole scene. One was that there was remains of a meal on the dining room table. Someone had tried to clean up the scene. There was some pots in the sink with diluted blood in it. So if someone had tried to mop up and clean up the scene in some way. There was milk bottles left in the letterbox that hadn't been picked up or collected. They got the strong impression that the couple had been missing for 4 or 5 days, and eventually they decided that they'd probably been killed on the Wednesday prior, 5 days prior, which means that Rochelle had been left alone in her cot for 5 days.
Is it likely that Rochelle, 18 months old, had survived those 5 days without food, without water, or is there speculation that someone might have been feeding her or looking out for her?
So this is one of the central mysteries of the entire case. So when she was found, she had very dirty nappies, like so dirty that the feces had kind of caked together. So the woman who took her in, Barbara Willis, she burned those nappies. She said they were so far gone and they really smelt horrendously that she couldn't do anything. She burned them, which, in hindsight, that was a mistake because they would have been kind of key evidence about if Rochelle had been fed or not. She was really dehydrated, but not so bad that she wasn't okay. A nurse came and looked at her that night and they decided that she didn't need any medical treatment other than some cream for some nappy rash and just, a lot of hydration, so a lot of milk. She was very thirsty. She kept drinking and she was really clingy. Barbara said that she just clung to her for weeks after she was found, and she also got really distressed when the phone rang, which made them think she'd been hearing the phone in the house ring. So the first doctor that they consulted, his name was Charles Fox, and he thought, that Rochelle was well covered, was the description they used. She was a very healthy child, and he thought that the tone of her kind of muscles and her legs and stuff showed that she'd lost a lot of weight. But like I said, she only had this nappy rash, she was fine otherwise, and so also it had been cold, so he thought, she wouldn't have been sweating and getting really dehydrated. So Dr. Fox said that he thought she might survive 5 days. So at that point, the police were like, okay, well, she could have been okay by herself. But at the same time as they got that information from Dr. Fox, they got 2 other pieces of information, which really just were very confusing for them and remain deeply confusing to this day. So the first piece of information they got, this is literally the day after the scene was found, was from a young labourer who'd been working in a paddock nearby. And he told police that he had seen a woman standing at the front of the Crewe property on the morning of June 19, which is 2 days after the couple supposedly went missing. So he saw a woman, she was dressed in slacks, standing there kind of in her 30s, light brown hair, and he could see the couple's car nearby, which was a dark green Hillman car. So that was the first sighting. There was a woman in the paddock on the Friday. And then the second sighting came from another woman called Queenie McConaughey, who was a local from Pukekohe, and she reported seeing a fair-haired little girl standing at the Crewe gate, near the road on the Saturday, so the next day. She said that she saw this little girl who was there, and as she drove past with her husband, the little girl kind of turned around and kind of toddled off, kind of ran off. And she also saw a light-coloured car parked outside the house gate. So altogether, those 3 pieces of information were very conflicting for the police. And, at this point they were trying to make a scene reconstruction and they basically couldn't because they just had, this couple who was supposed to be missing on the Wednesday, there's people seen at the house on the Friday and Saturday, but the baby is supposedly survived for 5 days on her own.
Let's talk about Len Demler, Jeanette's dad. He, as you said, lived next door, but he didn't check in for 5 days. Was that unusual? What sort of a person was he?
Well, Len was almost your stereotypical New Zealand farmer. He was known as a very, very hard worker. He'd basically broken in the land, his own farm next door, working for his dad back in the 1920s and 30s, cutting trees down one by one with an axe, making his own farm, the sort of the original New Zealand pioneer. He had these 2 daughters who he obviously loved. You can see it in the photos, the way they look at each other. And he married literally the girl next door, May Demler. And he was, by all accounts, a very good farmer. He was prudent. He made some good decisions. Just to go back about 20 years, on the Crewe farm, there'd been a very unfortunate accident. Len Demler's brother-in-law, that's his wife May's brother, had died in a tractor accident on that farm, on the Crewe farm in 1950. Len had helped identify the body. But Len then became a trustee and looked after the farm. And he was a very good trustee. He managed it very well with getting managers on. And so the farm grew and was profitable. And it was then handed on to Jeannette. There'd been a bit of bad blood in the family because Jeanette's mother, May, was quite a, by all accounts, conservative woman. And she was upset when Jeanette's sister, her name was Heather, began a relationship with a divorced man. That was considered a no-no in May Demler's world. And so she cut Heather out of her will, leaving all of her side of the family money to Jeannette. And so Jeannette inherited this farm, her uncle's farm, or at least half of it. The other half was bought by Harvey. So Len was known as a fairly laconic, is a word often used to describe him. But otherwise, people we've talked to in the neighbourhood who knew him said he was a straight-up, hard-working, good farmer and a good man, and they liked him as a neighbour. He seems to be a fairly normal, taciturn Kiwi bloke, loved his rugby, and was fully part of the community in that way. But he became a target for the police very early on because of what some people thought was his odd behaviour when the farmhouse murder scene was discovered.
Yeah, what did he have to say to police in terms of explaining the moment where he left Rochelle in that home? He discovers his daughter and son-in-law are missing. The 18-month-old granddaughter is there. There's blood everywhere, and yet he leaves her.
So when he was asked about that later, Len basically said that he panicked. He thought maybe somebody was still there and he wanted to get out of the house. He didn't know who was around. It seems like he went into autopilot. So, he's a farmer. He went home and he rang to cancel the stock truck because for him, like front of mind, there's a truck coming for some stock. He needs to go and tell that not to happen, that wouldn't have been good turning up in the middle of whatever's just happened. So he went home and he did that. And another thing that everyone finds very suspicious is that he rang the company and he couldn't actually get hold of the man he needed to speak to. So he waited at home for, must have been nearly 15 minutes for them to call him back. So he's just, waiting. I think who knows what he was doing in that time. And then he went, once he'd finally talked to them, then he went and got the neighbour and went back to the house. So he never really could properly explain it other than he was just panicking.
What happened in the months between the disappearance of Jeannette and Harvey Crewe and eventually the discovery of their bodies? How did the investigation progress?
That's when the police really honed in on Len Demler as a suspect. Maybe 2 or 3 days in, they decided that he was suspicious. They talked to a couple of neighbours, like James said, that really didn't like him. They kind of said that he was really callous when his wife was dying kind of the previous year, and they kind of had neighbourly beef with him. And I think the police just really picked up on that. Plus the fact, he was there, he'd found the scene. They thought that there was something in this rift with the family, with how, part of the farm had been left to Jeannette and Heather had been cut out. They got really myopic and they zeroed in on him and basically couldn't see anything else. They did, canvass the area and they did try and do all that sort of thing, but they mainly just repeatedly interviewed Len Demler. They kept bringing him down to the station, or they'd kind of turn up at his house and do these kind of, I don't know, like weird interviews with him where they try and say things to rile him up, like, there was one time when they were saying, imagine if the baby could talk, or she'll be old enough to talk soon and then, there'll be trouble. She'll definitely remember what had happened. Really just trying to get a rise out of him. They also kind of spread rumours around the community that it was him that was guilty, and, that started making his life really difficult. At one point they wired up his gate so that when he got home one night from the pub, it gave him an electric shock, which really upset him. And that was the point at which he actually got lawyers, because he kind of knew that he was, under suspicion.
There were some things, though, which gave the police some reason to look at him. One was that when the blood tests came back, they discovered that Jeanette's blood was found on the door of his car. and he was asked to explain that. Another one was during one of the interviews at the police station, he was asked to remove his shirt by Bruce Hutton, the officer leading the investigation, and he had scratch marks on his back. This was shortly after the disappearance, which we said would come from falling in some brambles, some nettles. A third thing, which was often remarked upon, is that after the disappearance there was a huge manhunt to try and find the bodies in the surrounding area. So the army was called and there were hundreds of locals turned up, and they just literally combed every bush, every valley, every piece of land they could. And this is a limestone country. There were what are called tomors, which are like holes in the limestone which go down some way, sort of. And so there were a lot of places to look where the bodies could have disappeared. And all of it was combed minutely. There were helicopters brought in. It's dramatic scenes, really. And Len, throughout all of this, did not join in the search, but shadowed the searchers on horseback. Was often seen sort of this remote figure in distance on horseback. And this was seen as very suspicious and turned many people against him.
Except that, remember, the police officer we spoke to, James, when we were writing the book, said that he thought that Demler hadn't joined in because he just had really terrible eyesight. He was like a champion bowler, like a very good lawn bowler. And somehow he was really good at that, despite having this dreadful eyesight. He was just very short-sighted. So whether or not, that is meaningful to the case kind of is still under debate.
What can you tell me about the discovery of Jeannette and Harvey Crewe's bodies? What was learned about how they died?
Well, Jeanette's was found first. So after they had no success in combing the local farmland and finding anything, the sort of search was wound down. The army was sent back, and it remained to about 3 or 4 officers sort of continuing working on the case. And one day some whitebaiters, people that were looking for whitebait in the nearby Waikato River, which is a huge river, New Zealand's longest river, working up and down the river, and they came across a body which was turned out to be Jeanette's body. Police were called, it was brought ashore, and at this point the police did a mysterious thing. They decided that this was their final opportunity to crack Len. So they sent a police car to pick up Len, brought him down to the river without telling him what it was about, and sprung it on him that, is this your daughter? Hoping that he would sort of break down and somehow confess the whole thing. And of course he didn't. But that is, again, his sort of fairly stoic reaction to that was considered to be further evidence against him. So that was in, I think, August when Jeanette's body was found. About a month or so later, in September 1970, 2 people were working up the river nearby, about a kilometre up the river, 10 miles from the Crewe farm. And they came across a second body. This was Harvey Crewe's body, and it was floating face down in the river. The police were called. They brought a boat. The body was still intact, but obviously fragile, so they summoned a cradle to put under the body. And as they were trying to manoeuvre this cradle under the body to retrieve it, the officer in charge, Bruce Hutton again, said he reached under the body and felt a piece of wire which had something attached to it, which was snagging the body, which is why they couldn't get the cradle under it. And as he reached down and grabbed this wire, something snapped and he felt the wire break free. They were then able to slide the cradle under the body and retrieve it. There were police divers on site. He sent the police divers down immediately to check under the body. It was only about 6 feet deep. Although there was no visibility, they managed to locate a metal bar, which turned out to be the front axle from a vintage car. And this was directly under where the body was found. And they generally believe to this day that this was attached to the wire and was used to weight Harvey's body. The body was brought ashore and analysed. When they found the bodies, they confirmed for the first time that both of them had been shot dead, because after autopsy they recovered the remains of .22 bullets, one in the head of Harvey Crewe and another in the head of Jeannette Crewe. And so they were able to confirm for the first time that both had been shot dead.
If they had been shot in the head, why was there so much blood in the home?
Well, after reconstructing it, they realised that Harvey, the way he'd been shot from one side of the head through to the other, and the angle in which the bullet was found, he must have been sitting in the armchair in which all the blood was found, and that he had died instantly and bled out in that chair. Jeannette was found with severe wounds to her face, particularly some of her teeth were broken, her eye socket was damaged badly, and there was bruising around her armpit. And the conclusion they drew was that Harvey had been shot first, sitting in his armchair, and died instantly. Jeannette had then probably confronted the attacker in some way and been hit or beaten, possibly with a rifle butt, fallen down and then been literally executed with a bullet in her temple which had killed her.
Once their bodies were found and police learned a little more about their final moments, did they consider anyone else that might have been responsible? I know police were at one point looking at Jeanette's sister.
So before they found the bodies, they had been looking into that idea that somehow the sister was involved or Len, and that it was tied up with the farm. And they'd kind of gone to see Len Demler's solicitor and his accountant. And quite soon before they died, Len's wife, who died, May Demler, her will had come up for probate. So that meant that the daughters had learned like the contents of the will. And that was, how much Jeanette was to inherit from her and that kind of thing, what kind of taxes would be attracted by the estate, all that kind of thing. So they looked into that after the deaths, and the police basically decided that if Demler had killed his daughter and Harvey, he wasn't losing or gaining anything. They basically decided it wasn't a viable motive because the farm would have gone to baby Rochelle. So therefore, if he really wanted to gain something, he would have had to kill the baby as well. That really kind of cast a spanner in the works. And then after they found the bodies, they really were still focused on Demler, but the other issue that they had was that Len Demler didn't have a gun. Like I already said, he had really bad eyesight. He didn't go shooting, and that was really hard. While the police were trying to make this case against him, it was like a really big weakness in the case. And instead what the police did was they collected all the 22 guns in the district. So I think they collected 64 within like a 5-mile radius of the farm, and then they also asked various people they knew who knew the family to bring their guns in as well. And they tested them, and those tests came up with just 2 guns that couldn't be ruled out. One belonged to a man called Arthur Allan Thomas, and that's when a second suspect was kind of brought into the fray.
The other thing that happened was that the police had several conferences amongst themselves over the course of the investigation. And there was frustration in police headquarters down in Wellington at the slow progress of the inquiry, particularly at a time, this is in New Zealand in 1970, and there have been a couple of other unexplained deaths in New Zealand, young women being murdered, their bodies found, and no murderer found. So there was a lot of public unease at the time, and the police really felt they had to do something and be seen to be doing something. So there was a lot of pressure on the police in this particular case to come up with a result. So they had head office looking over their shoulder all the time. And because of the slow progress, head office decided to send in 2 very senior heavyweight detectives, one from Christchurch, one from Wellington, to review the case. They got to Pukekohe and had the investigation laid out in front of them by Hutton. And he said, look, everything seems to be pointing to Demler. What do you think? And these 2 very senior detectives just said, frankly, look, you're barking up the wrong tree. There's clearly no evidence against Demler. You haven't got a rifle. There's no strong motive. What are you doing? And at that point, Hutton almost instantly sort of turned on his heel and said, wait a minute, I've got another suspect, Arthur Allan Thomas.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Emma Gillespie. I'm speaking with investigative journalists Kirsty Johnston and James Hollings about one of New Zealand's most infamous cold cases, the Crewe murders. Why Arthur Allan Thomas? Who was he? What was his connection to Jeanette and Harvey?
So Arthur's family also lived in Pukekohe. They were a really big family, the Thomas family, like lots of children. They lived there, from about the same time as the Crews. And Arthur and Jeanette had gone to primary school together, the little local primary school. And Arthur had a wee crush on Jeanette. She was very, very beautiful, tall, and from this lovely family. And he used to, what he described, kind of chase her around a bit when she was young, and really wanted to court her. They ended up, when they were kind of in their late teens, early 20s, they ended up living in another same small town, and he tried to take her out there. She was really polite, she was well versed in, manners. And so she kind of turned him down kindly. And then when she was overseas, he even wrote to her and sent her a couple of gifts. Like he was pretty keen on her. But at the same time, he was also dating lots of other women. And then, when she got home from overseas, he went round there and he took her a Christmas present, and Len Demler actually answered the door. This is obviously before she was married. And Jeannette came to the door and stood there kind of awkwardly at the back steps talking to Arthur, and he gave her this gift of it was like a brush and comb set. And she kind of said thank you, and she told him that she had a boyfriend, which wasn't true, but I think she was just trying to, let him down gently, kind of get rid of him. It seems like after that, Arthur, that was his last gasp at getting Jeannette to date him. And then he eventually married as well, and by the time of the murders, he was back living in Pukekohe at a farm kind of down the other end of town, about 15 miles away from the Crewe farm.
How did that sort of rejected lover narrative end up playing into the police investigation?
By that point, the Crews had gone missing in June. It was already September. The bodies had been found. It had been attracted a lot of media attention in this case, partly because the police had played that. They realised that they needed help to find sources of various bits of evidence that turned up, including the axle that was found with Harvey's body. So there's a lot of national interest in this case. And the pressure was on from above to find someone. For the first time, they had credible evidence that they'd found the rifle that had shot the Crews. And that was a game changer, really. Not only that, they also had something of a motive. And not only that, but the man they'd brought in, Len Johnston, remember the local cop who'd investigated the burglaries, he came in and he was put in charge of finding out where the axle found under Harvey's body had come from. And he did some pretty nifty work in managing to find not just where this axle had come from, but also two bits that were on this, had one point been attached to the axle. And he found them on the Thomas farm in somewhat mysterious circumstances. But he also managed to track the axle and show that it had probably come from a trailer from the Thomas farm. So within a very short space of time, they had not just the rifle that supposedly killed the Crews, but they also had shown the origin of the axle found with Harvey's body. And Johnston also, while looking through the Thomas farm, stumbled across two what's called stubs or hubs, which are the wheel hubs that are attached to the end of the axle, which have been cut off this axle with a gas torch and somehow been buried in the farm tip, and was shown to be a perfect match for this axle. So bingo, suddenly strong, hard evidence that linked Arthur Thomas to the Crews. So they then decided they had a case, and within a short time, Arthur was arrested.
Did Arthur Thomas have an alibi?
He did. He had a really strong alibi. He had a sick cow, so he was a dairy farmer. And the week of the murders, this cow had been going into labour, and it was kind of really struggling and it needed help. So they had it in the barn and they had it kind of slung up in a sling because it couldn't really stand. So they were trying to help it. So he said that night he was, working with this cow. And then secondly, his wife Vivian, she was home that night, and also his cousin Peter, who lived with them, he was home. And both of them told police that Arthur hadn't gone out that night. He'd come in from tending to this cow. He'd had dinner, and they've gone to bed. They went to bed pretty early because they're farming folk. And then Vivian, she steadfastly said that Arthur hadn't got out of bed, hadn't gone anywhere. And she maintained that the entire time. But it wasn't enough for the police. They just didn't really believe it.
So Arthur was arrested and charged with the murders of Jeannette and Harvey Crewe. How did the trial unfold? What was the evidence that really compelled a jury to find him guilty?
Yeah, the trial, it's so fast. Like these days, if you think there's a murder, you're probably not going to get to trial for at least a year in New Zealand, maybe not longer. But in this case, he was arrested. they were having depositions pretty quick, which is where they kind of run through, back in those days, they used to run through what evidence had been brought against the accused so that the judge could decide if there was like a case to answer or not. They had the depositions, and then the trial was like 2 weeks later. It's so fast. And the police just kind of threw everything at it. Like we've been saying, they just said, here's what happened. It was this gruesome murder of this lovely farming couple. Arthur could have got there. There was the axle. They said that there was some wire which had wrapped around the bodies. So both bodies were found with wire attached to them and had been used to kind of tie like a bedspread to each body, and then in Harvey's case to also tie on the axle. And the police argued that that wire was also matched to Arthur's farm. They said his gun matched the scene, and then they also said that they'd found a shell case that came from his gun in the garden at the Crewe's house. And kind of putting all that together, it was a compelling case, his motive of being obsessed with Jeannette, this kind of unable to let it go even though he was married. And the jury believed it. They went out, they were back within 2 hours. Like, it was extremely fast. And it was done, he was sentenced to life in prison.
There's a couple of other things as well also, that the police case, the Crown prosecutor was a young, very smart and very aggressive man called David Morris, whose own daughter had gone to St Cuthbert's, the same school that Jeannette had gone to. And he seemed to have a very strong emotional drive to get this case closed. And he was masterful by all accounts in his cross-examination and the way he led the case. As Kirsty said, one of the really compelling pieces of evidence was the shell case that was found in the garden just outside the Crewe's kitchen window, which was absolutely incontrovertible match for Arthur's rifle. The bullets, you could say, well, they seem like a match. You can't rule them out. They're similar. But the shell case, because of the imprint of the firing pin on it, was an absolute dead ringer match that had undoubtedly been fired from Arthur's rifle. Found outside the Crewe's kitchen window. Case closed.
We'll talk a little bit more about those cartridges shortly. But in terms of the fallout from the guilty verdict, Arthur charged with life in prison, what was the action to take an appeal from that process? I'm interested to understand this kind of unlikely committee of activists who emerged following that charge.
Okay, so after the conviction, there was sort of shock amongst the Thomas supporters because they'd been led to believe by their counsel, by Arthur's counsel, Paul Tim, that police didn't have a strong case and that they'd probably get off. In fact, they didn't think it would get past depositions. Arthur's mother had arranged a Christmas homecoming party for him. She convinced that he would be off. So they went back home and were sort of bewildered, really. But after a while, they started to gather their thoughts and realised that they needed to do something. And Arthur was very lucky. He had a very strong, caring family around him. Big family. He was one of, I think, 9 or 10 children. And his parents were very decent people. Also, his wife, Vivian, was a staunch supporter. Vivian's uncle, who had brought her out to New Zealand, was a man called Pat Vesey. Pat was one of the sort of real unsung heroes of this whole story because he was a signwriter by trade. And he had one great advantage, that he wasn't a Kiwi. He was an Aussie. And he didn't really care about New Zealand hierarchy or the New Zealand way of doing things. And he just started knocking on doors. And he said to us, people asked me how I did it. I just rang people up and said, I want to talk to you. And they would always invariably say yes. That was one of the great strengths of New Zealand at that time, that you could get access to MPs, even the Prime Minister. He was one of the driving forces who led what became the Thomas Retrial Committee, which tried to question and unpick the police evidence against Thomas.
How did that pan out? Because eventually Arthur is pardoned, but not long after that, there's a second murder charge for the same man for the same case. Is that right?
Okay, so he was convicted in 71. The retrial committee started to gather their thoughts and start to gather evidence. There'd already been some concern amongst the news media and various people about the conviction, but it was really just sort of whisperings, really. And, of course, Vivian, Arthur's wife, was a really great ally for him because she was media friendly. She was the farmer's wife who stayed on the farm and kept things going for Arthur, keeping the home fires burning while he was in prison, never afraid to give an interview, very good speaker. very good in front of the cameras. And so pressure slowly started to they started to gradually get a bit of media attention that they weren't going to go away quietly, the Thomases, and Arthur wasn't going to go down lightly. And so some of the first things they did was they started to question aspects of the evidence. They managed to get the government to agree to review the case. The government gave it to an old retired judge called McGregor. He wrote an opinion of the case saying, "Oh no, the conviction is safe, Arthur definitely did it, end of story." Pat Vesey wouldn't take no for an answer, and he went down and he asked if he could see McGregor. And he went and knocked on his door, and it turned out McGregor was basically senile, didn't really know what he was talking about. So he then went to see the Minister of Justice and was sort of given the brush off. He then went to see his local politician, a man called Robert Muldoon, very famous figure in New Zealand politics, eventually to become Prime Minister. And Muldoon said, he did hear him and listen to him. And Vesey said, "Look, if you do nothing else, will you go and see McGregor and see what I'm talking about? This guy is out to lunch." So Muldoon rang him back a couple of weeks later and said, I did what you said. I went and saw McGregor. And apparently McGregor had sort of sat down with Muldoon, who at that time was the Deputy Prime Minister. And McGregor had said to him after a few minutes, "So what newspaper are you from?" And if you know anything about Muldoon in New Zealand, you don't say that to Robert Muldoon and get away with it. So from that time on, Muldoon was, if not an ally, at least a listening ear in the whole case. From then, they managed to get the government to, after gathering and questioning more bits of the evidence, particularly around the cartridge case which was found, questioning whether the cartridge case could have been actually planted. So, for example, one of the things they did was they buried shell cases themselves in the Crewe farm property, and after 3 months dug them up and said, "Look, these are rusty. The Crewe case, the cartridge case which was used to convict Arthur, was not rusty." And on the basis of this kind of questioning of the evidence, they managed to get the government to agree to refer it to the Court of Appeal again in what's known as the first referral. And that Court of Appeal then said, "Look, there is new evidence here. We're not making a judgment as to whether Thomas is guilty or not, but we do think a court should hear this new evidence." So that's where the second trial came about.
What was the outcome of that second trial?
The second trial was really dramatic. So by that time, there'd been this kind of, the initial conviction, which was a huge shock. There'd been kind of 2 years where the retrial committee are working, day and night to try and get a new trial. They had a new lawyer and he'd been working around the clock. So this new lawyer was called Kevin Ryan, and he was like a well-known, he's just a real battler, he's a real fighter, and he immediately kind of got in Arthur's corner and went for it, basically. The thing that happened with the second trial was that Ryan wrote in his book later, he described it, he really wanted a fair hearing. He felt like the first time they hadn't had a fair go. He really wanted a fair go. But from the beginning, it kind of seemed a little bit doomed. The judge that was appointed to hear the trial was Ryan's kind of, not enemy, but it was the judge who'd been the harshest on him of any judges he knew, in the circuit. So he was really disappointed in that. And then what Ryan didn't know was that behind the scenes, the police had managed to get an early copy of the jury list. So what that meant was that the police were able to go around and instead of doing their normal and just crossing off anyone who has a conviction, off the list, they'd managed to go around to all these different police stations with the jury list and find out if the jurors had maybe family members who had a conviction or had a reason not to like the police. So by the time they got to the trial, the police were really well armed with all this information. And basically, in their view, they managed to stack the jury with people who'd be more friendly to their cause than to Arthur Thomas. So kind of right from the beginning, you can see it was very tense. The police also parked up a wee caravan on the court site where, they had a full monitoring station. I mean, it's still the 70s, so it's not super high tech, but they had, they had people in the hearing listening to the evidence, and then they were able to come back to the caravan, and then the Detective Inspector Hutton would be able to kind of utilise men in the field to come up with any, counter evidence. Everyone was kind of in their corners just fighting to the death, because what had happened in this 2 years of campaigning by the Thomas Retrial Committee was that the justice system itself had begun to feel kind of under siege, not only the police, but the lawyers and the judges, and just the kind of integrity of the system that's kind of supposed to be beyond reproach. So they were just embattled by them. And that kind of cast the mood of the entire trial. And it played out in a very similar manner to the first trial, like very similar evidence. There are a few little things that changed, but largely it was the same set of evidence. This time, the Crown, in the first trial, the Crown had really suggested strongly that Vivian might have fed the baby, which was kind of odd because they hadn't charged her with anything. They didn't charge her with being an accomplice, but it was just kind of convenient to their narrative that Arthur's wife might have helped him carry off this murder. By the time of the second trial, they had a witness who would say that the labourer that we talked about at the beginning, who saw a woman in the paddock, he was going to say that it wasn't her. So they went a bit easier on that. But largely it was the same evidence, and it led to the same result. Arthur was convicted again.
When was Arthur eventually pardoned, and how did that coincide with the kind of intensifying of questioning police evidence, suggestions of corruption at that time? How significant was that?
It took 6 years, another 6 years, before Arthur was eventually pardoned in 1979. And the pardon was a result of a really long campaign, first of all by the retrial committee, but particularly by an investigative journalist named Pat Booth and a forensic scientist called Ian Sprott, who joined forces at the end of the second trial and started to look at some of the detail of the police evidence and question it more closely. And that was what eventually undid the police case and led to the pardon. So at the end of the second trial, just at the last minute, and sort of quite dramatic moment, Pat Vesey, remember him? They'd been advertising around the country for .22 ammunition to be sent in, the bullets, particularly anything which had a number 8 on the bullet base of the bullet, because the bullets found in the Crewe's head had a number 8 engraved on the bottom. And part of the police case was that these number 8 bullets were very rare, and some of them were found on Arthur's farm, therefore made it more likely that he was the killer. The defence, of course, tried to show that they weren't rare. In fact, millions and millions of these bullets have been produced. And so lots of these bullets have been sent in from around the country by all sorts of people. And Pat Vesey describes a gang member arriving at his house one day with boxes of bullets, saying, "You think you might be interested in these?" And towards the end of the second trial, Pat Vesey had one of these kind of strange moments. And several people in this case have described similar moments where they sort of had some sort of mysterious force acting on them, which led them to do something. And Pat Vesey had one of these moments where he was just about to give evidence. He was about to be called into court to give evidence, and he said, "I've got to go home." Jumped in a cab, ran home, dug in a straw, and found one of these boxes of bullets that had been sent to him from someone around the country. Opened it up, and it had a series of instructions on it. Now, this box of bullets had been sent to him by a retired policeman who ran a gun shop in a remote little town called Dannevirke, about 200 or 300 miles from Auckland. And this gun shop owner, again one of the unsung heroes of this case, had been looking at these bullets, which he'd seen in the newspapers, and he had sort of started wondering about them. And what he'd realised was that the number 8 bullets found in the Crewe's heads were only ever fitted to a certain type of cartridge case. And the lettering on the cartridge case had the letters ICI on the bottom of the cartridge case because they were made by a company called Imperial Chemical Industries, I think that was called. And he came up with a theory that these number 8 bullets could not have been fitted to the cartridge case that was found in the Crewe garden. Remember the one that came from Thomas's gun? Anyway, he sent all this off to Pat Vesey, and Pat Vesey opened it literally in the last closing days of the second trial. And so the defence tried to argue that these number 8 bullets were never fitted to the shell cartridge case. That was the key piece of evidence against Thomas. The prosecution managed to bat that away. They got the manager of ICI in Australia on the phone. He said, no, we've never changed the lettering on our cartridge cases. It's nonsense. So that didn't go anywhere. However, after the case finished, Pat Booth and Ian Sprott decided to look at this further. And what they noticed was that the lettering on the bottom of the cartridge case, ICI, which is stamped onto the bottom of each cartridge by a machine at the factory, seemed to change. Some cartridge cases had a very big letter C on them. Some had quite a much smaller letter C. To cut a long story short, they went to Australia where these cartridge cases were made. They went first of all to the Australian police actually in Melbourne, and they showed them these cartridge cases, some with a big letter C and some with a small letter C. And the Australian police were very helpful, unlike the New Zealand police, put them in a comparison microscope and said, yes, you're absolutely right. There's clearly a difference between the letters C on the bottom of these cartridge cases. So then we went back to ICI in Australia, in Melbourne, and said, look, you said that you've never changed the letter C, but actually, how do you explain this? One C on one cartridge case is big and another one on another is small. What's your explanation? So there was scurrying around at ICI headquarters, and they dug up the engraver. I wouldn't say dug him up, he was still alive, but his name was George Layton. And George Layton said, oh, yes, you're absolutely right. I did change the letter C because as an engraver, I realised that it was kind of a complicated technical reason, but you have to make the C a bit larger to make it look the same to the naked eye. So at one point I realised that the machine that produced the stamping on the bottom of the cartridge case had this really a kind of an amateur job done of the engraving. So I fixed it. And he said, I did that. I think it was around 1967 or thereabouts. And so that was the key which unlocked the whole Thomas case, because then they were able to show that the cartridge case that had been found in the Crewe garden had been made in 1967 or 68, I think it was, and therefore could never have been fitted to one of those number 8 bullets, because number 8 bullets were no longer produced after 1963 and could never have been fitted to that kind of cartridge case. And they were able to prove from the records of ICI that garden cartridge case could never have been fitted to a number 8 bullet. And therefore, they were able to prove effectively that it must have been planted because it could never have been attached to the bullet that shot the Crews. Once that evidence was established, the retrial committee was able to go back to the government. There's a long series of legal battles. First of all, they went to the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal effectively said, well, yes, you're right, but we still don't think it should go back to another trial. Then they went to the Privy Council in London, which at the time was New Zealand's highest court. They effectively said we haven't got jurisdiction to rule on this. Then they wrote to the Ministry of Justice. The Ministry of Justice commissioned some internal reports, and they said, sorry, but there's no really strong evidence here. We don't think anything should be done. Thomas should stay in prison. Finally, another outsider, a guy called David Yallop, who was a British journalist, came to New Zealand and wrote a book, and which he sort of unlaid all this evidence, some of which had been published in newspapers at the time, of course, put it all together and wrote it in this book, which sort of became a bestseller. This is 1978. And that prompted Mr. Muldoon, who was by then Prime Minister, to commission a QC to look at this new evidence. The QC looked at the evidence, came back with a report to the Minister of Justice, who said, I don't believe this conviction is safe. And the government at the time then said, okay, well, if it's not safe, we have to do something. We can either refer it to the Court of Appeal again to decide whether there should be another trial, or we can pardon him. And the government decided to pardon Arthur Allan Thomas. And that should have been possibly where the story ended, except there was a very interesting postscript.
Were the detectives held to account from that point? We know that the shell case is essentially planted. Arthur is framed. What is the postscript from there, as you mentioned?
One of the things that happened was that one of the reasons they couldn't have a new trial when they discovered the conviction was unsafe was because the police had helpfully thrown out all the key evidence, literally thrown it into the tip, like a rubbish tip nearby. So that wasn't an option. This case is kind of marked by things like that, isn't it, James? So at that point there, they'd thrown out the bullets out. They kept the axle. It's one of the only things left.
They threw out the shell case, which was the one that was planted. Effectively, it was replanted in the tip. Now, it was interesting at the time because when they threw all this out in about 1973, supposedly on the instructions of David Morris, when this news came out at the time, there was sort of a general outcry. Well, how could you do this? This is clearly an ongoing saga, and you've destroyed the evidence. And the Minister of Justice at the time said he was very disturbed about it. Hundreds of people came forward and said, well, search the tip to try and find it. This is the kind of level of public concern there was about unease about this case. So as Kirsty says, that was, I guess, the main reason why effectively eventually it was decided that he had to be pardoned, because they couldn't have another trial because there was no evidence left.
Did that significantly change the values in the community about their perception of the police force? Was this the first sort of time that people had begun to think, well, is the police force trustworthy? What was the impact?
Yeah, it's often described as New Zealand's kind of loss of innocence, because before that, people here generally had faith in the police. A lot of the things that have since happened have kind of changed that perspective as well, but this really was the first time people had openly seen the police, I guess, working against, good, hardworking, middle-class people. I mean, the people in this case aren't not like agitators, they're farming people. Arthur Thomas was just he was a hardworking farmer, and he effectively got fitted up. And I think the thing that really sealed that into people's minds was in 1980, the government decided to have like a commission of inquiry into the conviction of Arthur Allan Thomas. And again, they got in an Australian to head that. He was a judge from Australia called Robert Taylor, and they flew him in to kind of head this, this inquiry panel into the conviction. And during that inquiry, it became kind of more and more obvious as it drew out that the police probably did plant that cartridge case. And, the police were deeply unhappy about this. They even went to court to try and stop the inquiry at one point. They were battling with this Australian judge every step of the way. I think he formed the view, that the police were basically being difficult and kind of trying to stymie this investigation. He was quite harsh on them. At one point, he even just threatened to quit the inquiry, and the Minister of Justice at the time kind of had to talk him back around into staying. But yeah, the consequence of that inquiry was that they found that the bullet had been planted. But to answer your earlier question, no, the police didn't really face any consequences for that. They were never charged, and the officer in charge he maintained that he didn't plant it, and that his deputy, the other detective, the guy called Len Johnston, he'd actually died by then. But, everyone said he was a good guy, and all his fellow officers said, he'd never do anything like that. So really remained at an impasse, except, of course, in the public's mind. I think most New Zealanders would now, agree that it probably was planted.
Over 50 years have now passed since Jeannette and Harvey Crewe were murdered in their homes. A man convicted twice and pardoned. Has anyone been held responsible for their death?
No one's ever been convicted or even charged with murder since Arthur Allan Thomas was pardoned. Not to say there hasn't been numerous attempts by amateur detectives to point the finger at various people, Len Demler included. There was a sort of flurry of interest in the case around about 2000 to 2010. There were several books which came out. Various suspects were named. Len Demler was targeted by one. He said it must have been him. Another book came out which said it was actually Len Johnston, the police officer who initially investigated. Those are the two main suspects that have been sort of named by various writers. But then in 2010, Rochelle Crewe herself, by that time had a different name, contacted the Prime Minister and asked for a police investigation into what happened. And I think particularly with a view to clearing what she believed was her grandfather's name, Len Demler. And so the government agreed to commission a police review. They asked the police to do a thorough review of the case. The police spent about 3 years going over all the evidence, interviewing a lot of the witnesses again, and eventually came up with a massive report into the case, which sort of exhaustively looks at almost everything. Its conclusion, it did not point the finger at any one person. It admitted probably for the first time that the cartridge case probably had been planted, although it didn't completely admit it. But it was really, I think, the most open and transparent attempt by the police to actually look at their own behaviour as well as the whole case in general, and did a reasonably honest job of looking at the evidence. I think there was still a little bit of a lens of tending to take the police view of things in some areas, but I think overall it was a genuinely honest attempt by the police to look at the evidence. And eventually they concluded that there is some evidence that points to the Thomas farm, particularly the wire that was found with the Crewe body, and the axle and the bullets. Some of that evidence you could contest, but still no conclusion about who actually killed them. I think one of the most interesting things they came up with was a psychological profile of who the killer most likely was.
So what the psychologist said who did the profile of the killer was that he basically thought that Arthur Thomas, the motive that police had come up for him, that he was like morbidly infatuated with Jeannette, just didn't stack up. He just really didn't think that the police had enough to suggest that Arthur was like stalking her, because they thought there would have been other signs, like his behaviour would have been strange, like kind of antisocial and strange. So they just disregarded Arthur Thomas as a suspect, basically. What he did say, though, was he thought that the killings might have been motivated by somebody with an intense dislike for Harvey Crewe, because Harvey was quite a difficult man in some regards. Like, he was very exacting and he could be quite belligerent when he wanted to be. Like with his farm, he was very perfectionist. At his home, for example, he had tradies that had come to the home to fix things after the fire, and there was one who he got into a disagreement with because he didn't think the work was up to standard, so he refused to pay him. Like, Harvey had kind of a few incidents like that with people, and like we said, people in the district found him kind of not unfriendly, but just a bit distant. So the profiler felt that maybe there had been an incident with Harvey and maybe a contractor or a neighbour or somebody like that had sparked these events. First the burglary, then the fires. He definitely thought they were linked. And then the murder, it kind of escalated to this point of murder. So what he thought was the killer was probably likely to be somebody local, because they would have had access to do the burglary and then the fires and then the murder. Probably a healthy guy, because obviously he had to, shoot someone in the middle of the night, maybe through a window. Probably single, like someone who didn't really have to explain his random absences to his family, or maybe that he used like a cover, like going to an activity to cover going out that night. He said it wasn't sexually motivated, probably had access to a vehicle, and like probably rural, like comfortable with farms. And the direct shots to the head, he said, like the execution styles, killing of Jeannette in particular, suggested maybe like a hunter or a farmer, somebody who kind of was comfortable with killing animals in that way. Maybe someone experienced with wire, because they used the wire to wrap the bodies, and who had knowledge of the river as well. The profiler thought that maybe the person didn't really plan the murders that well. He probably didn't plan particularly wanting to dispose of the bodies, because where like the killings themselves were quite seamless, I guess, if that's what you want to call it, the disposal, like the cleanup, was just really rushed. Like how James was talking, how the person got halfway through cleaning up the blood and then just kind of abandoned it, and how they'd had to use bedding from the home and these like scrappy bits of wire to tie them up with. But generally, he said this person would be quite patient, quite calculated, maybe somebody with links to the Thomas farm, or who kind of lived in the area. Yeah, that was his conclusion, and it seems like the wider police review team agreed with that as well.
And is this case still open? Is there any chance that someone will be held responsible one day, or will this just remain a cold case mystery forever?
So we both personally think, James and I, that it probably won't be solved, and I can't really explain why, other than we just got the feeling when we were investigating it that most people who knew about it have died by now, or if somebody can keep a secret for 50 years, it just really felt to me like they would always keep that secret. However, it does remain open. When we were investigating it, we told the police we had a couple of things we thought they might be interested in, and they immediately wanted to meet with us. So they really suggested to us that, they would be motivated if they could, of course, to try and find the killer. And, Rochelle, who was the baby at the time, she's still alive, and the saddest thing for her is never having that justice. So I'm sure she would welcome anyone who has further information to come forward.
A huge thanks to Kirsty and James for assisting us to tell this story. Their book about the Crewe murders will be out later this year if you'd like to learn more about the intricacies of this case. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted and produced by me, Emma Gillespie, with audio design by Madeline Joannou. Our executive producer is Gia Moylan. If you have any feedback about today's episode or an idea of a case we should cover, you can get in touch with us at truecrime@mamamia.com.au. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another true crime conversation.